The Bride Who Vanished at the Altar. Dear listeners, welcome back to Tea Time Mysteries. I'm your host Henry, and I'm glad you're here. Wherever you're listening from across Asia, these cosy Miss Marple mysteries bring us together. Tonight's story was chosen by our community. Thank you for being part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now pour your tea and let's begin. Chapter 1. The wedding that never was. St. Stephen's Church stood at the far edge of the village of Little Barton. Its grey stones softened by centuries of ivy, and its modest bell tower rising just high enough to be seen from the high road. On the morning of the wedding, the churchyard had been transformed. White ribbons fluttered from the wrought iron gates, roses spilled from wicker baskets, and the air was thick with the mingled scents of lilac, cut grass and expectation. Weddings, in Little Barton, were communal affairs. They belonged not only to bride and groom but to the village itself, its gossip, its pride, and its unspoken comparisons to every wedding that had come before. This one, however, carried an added charge of anticipation. Miss Arabella Finch, the bride, was not only young and beautiful but wealthy, the sole heir to Finchwood House and its surrounding lands. Her marriage to Mr. Oliver Grant, recently arrived from London, and possessed of an agreeable manner and a pleasing face, had been the subject of endless speculation. Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly in the third pew from the front, observed it all with mild interest. She had chosen her place carefully, near enough to see, far enough not to be noticed. Her gloved hands rested in her lap, knitting needles clicking softly as if by habit rather than necessity. She had known Arabella since the girl was in short frocks, had watched her grow into womanhood, and had noted with gentle concern the suddenness of the engagement. "It does all seem very quick," Miss Marple murmured to her neighbour, Mrs. Dolly Pritchard, whose bonnet strained heroically against the enthusiasm with which she craned her neck toward the church doors. "Quick," Mrs. Pritchard whispered back. "My dear Miss Marple, when a girl has money like that, there's always someone quick enough to take an interest." Miss Marple smiled faintly but said nothing. She had noticed as well the way Mr. Grant smiled, too evenly perhaps, and how his eyes, though pleasant, seemed to calculate rather than warm. The groom stood at the altar now, tall and composed, his best man Henry Collins beside him, mopping his brow with a handkerchief that had already seen better days. The vicar shuffled his papers, coughed discreetly, and glanced once more at the clock. There was a pause, then another. A ripple of unease passed through the congregation, subtle at first, like the moment before a summer storm. Heads turned, whispers stirred. "She'll be late," someone muttered. "Brides always are." Yet Miss Marple's eyes had narrowed slightly. Arabella Finch was not the sort of young woman to be late. She had been trained, from childhood, to value punctuality almost as highly as propriety. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The organist shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Grant's smile tightened, imperceptibly but unmistakably, and he leaned toward the vicar to whisper something. The vicar nodded and cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said aloud, attempting cheerfulness, "there has been some small delay at Finchwood House. We shall wait a little longer." Waiting, however, did not suit Little Barton. Mrs. Pritchard rose first, peering toward the doors. "I'll just step outside," she said, already halfway up the aisle. "See if there's news." Others followed. The church emptied in small, murmuring groups, leaving only a few seated figures and the increasingly strained groom at the altar. Miss Marple remained where she was, her knitting forgotten now, her eyes thoughtful. Outside, the June sunshine seemed suddenly too bright. The bridal car stood empty near the gates, its white ribbons fluttering mockingly in the breeze. The driver, pale and flustered, wrung his cap between his hands. "I brought Miss Finch as far as the churchyard," he insisted to anyone who would listen. "She told me to wait, said she wished for a moment alone." "A moment alone," Mrs. Pritchard echoed. "On her wedding day?" Miss Marple had joined the group quietly. "Young women sometimes do," she said gently, "though it is not always wise." A search began, at first polite, then increasingly frantic. The vestry was checked, the churchyard paths, even the small stand of trees beyond the wall. Arabella Finch was nowhere to be found. By midday, the mood had shifted entirely. The ribbons were torn down, the roses trampled. The vicar retreated indoors, looking years older. Mr. Grant stood apart, his expression one of shocked concern. perhaps too carefully composed. "It's not like her," he said to Inspector Lionel Graves, who had arrived from the neighbouring town. "Arabella wouldn't run away. She was happy. We were happy." Inspector Graves, a broad-shouldered man with a practical manner, nodded. "People are often not as happy as they appear, Mr. Grant." Miss Marple, seated on a low stone wall, observed the exchange. She noticed how Mr. Grant's hand clenched at the word "run away," and how he did not quite meet the inspector's eyes. By late afternoon, the word disappearance had been replaced with a far graver one. Arabella Finch had been found. The body lay at the edge of the old chalk pit 1/2 a mile from the church, hidden among brambles and wildflowers. Her wedding dress was torn and stained, her veil tangled in the thorns. Death, the doctor said quietly, had been swift. The village of Little Barton reeled. Shock hardened quickly into speculation, and speculation into certainty. Voices rose, names were whispered, and every kindness of the past was re-examined for darker meaning. Miss Marple returned home that evening, her steps slow but steady. She set aside her hat, poured herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window overlooking her small garden. The roses there were late this year, she noted absently. "A bride who vanishes at the altar," she murmured. "I have known 2 such cases in my lifetime." She thought of Arabella's face that morning, serene, perhaps a little pale, and of the way the girl had kissed her cheek before stepping into the car. "Whatever happened," Miss Marple said softly to the empty room, "began long before today." Outside, the village lights flickered on one by one. Little Barton would not sleep easily that night, and Miss Marple, knitting, reflected, as she so often did, on how the most dreadful things so often grow from the smallest seeds, planted quietly in the hearts of ordinary people. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Wake. Little Barton awoke the following morning with the uneasy sensation that something permanent had shifted overnight. The lanes were the same, the hedges trimmed as ever, and the church bell rang out its customary hour, but beneath the surface the village hummed with restless energy. Curtains twitched, doors opened and closed with unusual frequency. Tragedy, like rain after drought, had loosened every tongue. By 10 o'clock the Blue Boar Inn had become the unofficial headquarters of speculation. Mrs. Dolly Pritchard presided over a corner table with the authority of a magistrate, her teacup untouched as she leaned forward eagerly. "I always said it was a mistake," she announced to anyone within earshot. "That Mr. Grant too smooth by half. London men usually are." "Now, Dolly," said Mr. Edwin Harper, the retired schoolmaster, "there's no proof of anything yet." Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "There never is at first. That's how these things work." Miss Marple arrived quietly, settling herself near the window with a pot of tea and a slice of seed cake. She listened, her expression mild, her attention keen. Villagers drifted in and out, each carrying a fragment of information, a remembered slight, or a newly sharpened suspicion. "I heard they quarrelled last night," whispered Lucy Bell, the grocer's daughter. "Arabella and Mr. Grant, I mean. Mrs. Finchwood's old housekeeper told my aunt." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "Did she, dear? And what was the quarrel about?" Lucy hesitated. "Money, I think. Or perhaps, well, someone from his past." "That's always a popular subject," Miss Marple said gently. "Past lives have a habit of catching up with us." Across the room, Inspector Lionel Graves entered, removing his hat with a weary air. Conversations faltered, then resumed in quieter tones. He ordered coffee and scanned the room, his gaze lingering briefly on Miss Marple before moving on. He had met her before, everyone in the district had sooner or later, but like most professionals he underestimated her. The official investigation was already underway. Finchwood House had been sealed, servants questioned, letters examined. The inspector's early conclusions, however, were forming rapidly. "The groom is the obvious place to look," he confided later to the vicar. "Last known person to see her alive, substantial financial benefit, no solid alibi." Miss Marple, passing nearby, heard every word. She paused, adjusted her gloves and smiled politely at the inspector. "Such cases are often obvious," she said, "and just as often misleading." Inspector Graves chuckled. "I dare say, Miss Marple, but we must start somewhere." "Indeed," she agreed. "One usually does." That afternoon, the village was treated to its first collective shock since the discovery of Arabella's body. Mr. Oliver Grant was taken in for questioning. Though not formally arrested, the sight of him entering the police motor car was enough to set little Barton buzzing anew. "He looks guilty," Mrs. Pritchard declared triumphantly. "Did you see his face?" Miss Marple had. She had also noticed something else, the faint irritation beneath his grief, as though events were inconveniencing him. Later, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Finchwood House. The great building loomed heavy with silence, its windows darkened, its gardens neglected for the first time in living memory. She was admitted by Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, whose red-rimmed eyes spoke of shock and exhaustion. "I can't believe she's gone," Mrs. Hawthorne said, twisting her apron. "I raised her, in a manner of speaking." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. And on her wedding day, too. Such a cruel blow. They sat together in the morning room, sunlight slanting across the empty chairs where wedding gifts still lay unopened. Miss Marple's eyes drifted, apparently idly, from object to object. "Tell me, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said at last. "Was Miss Finch troubled recently? Anything out of the ordinary?" The housekeeper hesitated. She'd been receiving letters, private ones. She kept them locked away. "From Mr. Grant?" "No, I don't think so. Different handwriting." Miss Marple's needles paused in mid-click. "And did she seem distressed?" "Not distressed exactly. Thoughtful. Once or twice. Afraid, perhaps." "Afraid?" Miss Marple repeated softly. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded. "She asked me, only last week, if I thought people could pretend to be something they weren't. I told her they could." Miss Marple smiled faintly. A wise answer. As she left Finchwood House, Miss Marple encountered Henry Collins, the best man, lingering near the gates. He looked pale and ill at ease. "A dreadful business," he said quickly. "None of us suspected—" "Did you know Miss Finch well?" Miss Marple asked. "Not well. She was charming, of course. But Oliver, Mr. Grant, was my friend. I introduced them." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, introductions are such powerful things." Mr. Collins flushed. "If I had known—" "Known what?" Miss Marple asked mildly. He faltered, then shook his head. "Nothing. I mean, nothing at all." That evening gossip took on sharper edges. Another rumour spread. Arabella Finch had been seen arguing with someone near the chalk pit days before the wedding. No one could quite agree who that someone was. "A woman," said one. "A man," insisted another. Miss Marple, seated once more by her window, considered this carefully. Arguments she knew were common enough. What mattered was who had something to lose. She recalled Arabella's question about pretences. She recalled Mr. Grant's clenched hand. She recalled Henry Collins's discomfort. "So many secrets," Miss Marple murmured, "and everyone so certain they know the answer." Outside, the moon rose pale and watchful over Little Barton. The village had found its first suspect and was eager to be satisfied. But Miss Marple, stirring her tea thoughtfully, knew that certainty was the most dangerous thing of all. For the truth, she reflected, was rarely the one people were most ready to believe. Chapter 3. The obvious answer. By the third day, certainty had settled over Little Barton like a heavy fog. It was not merely suspicion now, but conviction, shaped and reinforced by repetition. When enough people said the same thing often enough, it became, at least in the village mind, truth. Mr. Brace. Oliver Grant, the groom who never became a husband, was guilty. Miss Marple encountered this belief everywhere she went. At the baker's, Mrs. Linton leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. "I always thought he had a look about him," she said. "Not a bad look exactly, just not right." At the post office, Mr. Giles declared, "If you ask me, it's greed. That kind of money does things to a man." Miss Marple smiled politely and said nothing. People she knew liked a tidy explanation. A stranger from London with no roots in the village and everything to gain made an excellent villain. Inspector Graves appeared to agree. That afternoon he paid Miss Marple a courtesy call, removing his hat with a hint of sheepishness. "I thought I should inform you," he said, "that Mr. Grant will be formally charged. Circumstantial evidence, but strong enough." "Circumstantial evidence is often very strong," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea. "It is also very flexible," Graves chuckled. "You've always had a way of putting things, Miss Marple. Still, he quarrelled with Miss Finch, benefited financially, and has no satisfactory account of his movements that morning." Miss Marple handed him his cup. "And does his account change?" The inspector paused. "No." "People who lie," she said gently. usually improve their stories. Graves frowned slightly but shook it off. We'll see. The magistrate thinks it's sufficient. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting forgotten once again. She thought of Arabella's locked letters and of the fear Mrs. Hawthorne had described. None of it quite fitted the neat picture the village was assembling. Later that day, she visited Miss Eleanor Briggs, Arabella's former governess, now retired and living in a small cottage near the green. Miss Briggs received her stiffly but warmed once tea was served. Arabella was a good girl, Miss Briggs said firmly, headstrong at times, but not foolish. Was she in love? Miss Marple asked. Miss Briggs hesitated. I believe she wished to be. That is not quite the same thing. Miss Marple nodded. Did she ever speak of regretting the engagement? No, but she did speak of being watched. Watched? Miss Marple echoed. She said someone knew things about her family. Old things. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Her family history is not widely known, I believe. Miss Briggs shook her head. No, only fragments. A scandal many years ago, quietly buried. That evening brought yet another development. A letter was discovered among Arabella's belongings, unsent, unfinished, its tones strained. I cannot go through with this unless you tell me the truth. I have been too trusting. If you do not come to me at once, I shall be forced to act. Inspector Graves regarded it grimly. Sounds like she was confronting Grant. Miss Marple, standing nearby, read the letter carefully. It does, she agreed, though she does not name him. Graves shrugged. Why would she? Miss Marple did not answer. She was thinking instead of how often people wrote what they wished to believe, rather than what they knew. That night the village gathered again at the Blue Boar, this time with a grim satisfaction. The mystery, it seemed, was all but solved. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, listening. She noticed who spoke most loudly and who remained silent. Henry Collins did not appear at all, nor did Mrs. Hawthorne. Absences, Miss Marple reflected, were sometimes more telling than presences. As she walked home beneath the stars, she paused at the edge of the green, gazing toward the distant outline of the chalk pit. The path leading there was well worn, not newly trampled as one might expect from a hurried struggle. So calm, she murmured, almost deliberate. She remembered a girl from her youth who had once been driven to desperation by a secret she could not escape. The outcome had been terrible and entirely misunderstood. Human nature does repeat itself, Miss Marple said softly. The village believed the answer was obvious. The inspector was satisfied. Justice, it seemed, would soon be served, but Miss Marple felt no such certainty. For in her long experience, the most dangerous criminal was not the one everyone feared, but the one everyone trusted. Chapter 4. The smallest detail. Little Barton's confidence in its conclusion grew stronger by the hour. Once a story settled into place, the village polished it lovingly, smoothing away any awkward corners. By the fourth day, people spoke of the crime in the past tense, as though its meaning had already been fixed beyond dispute. Miss Marple alone appeared untouched by this sense of finality. That morning she took a slow walk along the lane leading toward the chalk pit. The path was narrow, bordered by cow parsley and nettles, and bore the marks of many passing feet, some recent, others older. She paused often, peering down with mild curiosity, as though merely admiring wildflowers. To an untrained eye there was nothing remarkable here. To Miss Marple there was. She bent carefully, adjusting her spectacles, and studied the ground near a shallow dip where rainwater collected. There were footprints, men's boots, women's shoes, but one set caught her attention, smaller, lighter, with a distinct pattern at the heel. Unusual, she murmured. Arabella Finch's wedding shoes, she recalled, were satin slippers, hardly suited for walking this path. These prints were practical, sensible, made for distance. Miss Marple straightened slowly. People do not usually change their shoes without a reason. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Graves, striding along with purposeful steps. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Still taking an interest?" "Oh yes," she said pleasantly. "It is such a habit of mine." He followed her gaze to the ground. "We've been over this area thoroughly. I'm sure you have," she replied, though one does sometimes overlook what seems unimportant. Graves smiled indulgently. "Such as?" "Shoes," Miss Marple said simply. He raised an eyebrow. "Shoes?" "Women's shoes tell stories," she continued. A lady does not walk half a mile over rough ground in wedding slippers. She would change them. Graves considered this briefly. We found no spare shoes at Finchwood House. Then perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, she changed elsewhere. He made a note, more out of courtesy than conviction. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Edith Fowler, Arabella's distant cousin and one of her bridesmaids. Mrs. Fowler lived in a neat cottage with lace curtains and an air of quiet superiority. Arabella was terribly nervous, Mrs. Fowler said. I thought it only natural. Nerves often come from somewhere, Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Fowler smiled thinly. She was prone to melodrama. Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Fowler's shoes. Sensible, well worn, with a distinctive heel. Very practical for walking. Such sturdy footwear, Miss Marple remarked. One would hardly expect it for a wedding. Mrs. Fowler stiffened. One never knows what errands might arise. Indeed, Miss Marple thought. That evening brought further revelations. Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper, came to Miss Marple's door, visibly shaken. I remembered something, she said urgently. The morning of the wedding, Miss Finch took her old walking shoes from the cupboard, said she wanted them close at hand. And did she put them on? Miss Marple asked. I didn't see her do it. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you. That is most helpful. After Mrs. Hawthorne left, Miss Marple sat quietly, arranging facts as she might arrange flowers. Arabella had anticipated a walk. She had expected to meet someone away from the church, someone she trusted, or feared. Yet the footprints Miss Marple had seen were not Arabella's alone. There had been 2 sets, one light, one heavier, and both had turned back. The village slept soundly that night, satisfied with its villain. Miss Marple did not. She lay awake, considering how often people underestimated the significance of the smallest details. Shoes, letters, fear, she whispered, and someone who knew exactly where to lead her. In the distance, the chalk pit lay silent, keeping its secrets for now. Chapter 5. Confrontations and Old Shadows. The 5th day after Arabella Finch's death brought with it a change in atmosphere. The early shock had settled into something colder and more deliberate. Inspector Graves, encouraged by the magistrate and the village's near-unanimous opinion, pressed forward with his case against Oliver Grant. Yet even as certainty hardened, faint cracks began to show. Miss Marple noticed them at once. She encountered Mr. Grant that morning quite by chance, or so it appeared, outside the solicitor's office in Market Belling. He looked thinner, his well-cut suit hanging slightly askew, his usual composure strained. Miss Marple, he said, forcing a polite smile, I suppose you believe me guilty, like everyone else? Miss Marple regarded him with kind, pale eyes. I believe very little without understanding a great deal. That's a relief, he said bitterly. Understanding seems in short supply. They walked together a short distance. Miss Marple said nothing at first, allowing silence to do its work. Arabella was afraid, she said at last. Mr. Grant stopped. Afraid of what? That, Miss Marple replied gently, is what I am trying to discover. His expression shifted. Relief, irritation, something sharper. She was under strain. Wedding nerves, family expectations. Family history can be a strain, Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Grant's eyes flickered away. You've been talking to people? I always do, he laughed shortly. Then you know as much as anyone. Probably more. As they parted, Miss Marple noted one thing above all else. His fear was not the fear of exposure, but of helplessness. It reminded her unpleasantly of men she had known who were trapped by circumstances rather than driven by malice. That afternoon, Miss Marple turned her attention to those who had been closest to Arabella. Finchwood House, though officially sealed, had become a place of quiet visits and whispered conversations. Mrs. Hawthorne was relieved to see her. They're asking such dreadful questions, she said, about the family, about Arabella's mother. Your mistress was very young when she died, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded, and not well regarded, if truth be told. Because of the child? Yes, Arabella was born under unfortunate circumstances. Her father paid handsomely to keep it quiet. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Scandals buried too deeply have a way of pushing back. That same evening, Henry Collins finally reappeared in the village. Miss Marple encountered him near the post office. his manner nervous, his eyes darting. "You've been away," she observed. "Business?" he said quickly. "During a murder investigation?" He flushed. "I didn't think—" "No," Miss Marple said. "You probably didn't." She asked him to walk with her. Against his better judgment, he agreed. "You introduced Oliver Grant to Arabella," Miss Marple said. "Yes." "And you knew something of his past?" "Nothing important." Miss Marple stopped walking. Mr. Collins' lies often begin with the word nothing. He swallowed. "There were debts. He asked for help. I thought marriage would solve things." "Marriage solves very little," Miss Marple replied. "It merely rearranges problems." Henry Collins's composure cracked. "I never meant for her to be hurt. Yet someone did hurt her." That night a new rumour surfaced. Mrs. Edith Fowler had been seen near the chalk pit early on the wedding morning. Mrs. Fowler dismissed it with icy dignity. "I walk for my health," she said. "Must I account for every step?" Miss Marple paid her another visit. "You loved Arabella," Miss Marple said. "I envied her," Mrs. Fowler corrected. "There is a difference." "And yet you were willing to help her." Mrs. Fowler hesitated. "She asked me to meet her. She was frightened." "At the chalk pit?" "Yes. She said she needed advice." Miss Marple's voice remained mild. Advice often becomes something else under pressure. Mrs. Fowler's hands clenched. "She was alive when I left her." Miss Marple believed that, mostly. By the end of the day, Inspector Graves found himself unexpectedly unsettled. Statements contradicted one another. Timelines blurred. The case was no longer quite so tidy. Miss Marple, walking home beneath a bruised evening sky, felt the shape of the truth forming at last. Not complete, but unmistakable. Arabella had not fled. She had not been surprised. She had gone to meet someone she knew, and someone else had been watching. The village slept, unaware that its certainty was already unravelling. Miss Marple, arranging her thoughts like pieces of a familiar puzzle, knew that the most dangerous moment was approaching. Not the crime itself, but the instant when the murderer realised they had been understood, and that moment she suspected was very near indeed. Chapter 6. The Second Disturbance. The village awoke on the 6th morning to a sensation distinctly different from grief or certainty. This time it was unease, sharper, more personal, and far less comfortable. When certainty is shaken, people grow irritable. When suspicion widens, they grow afraid. Miss Marple sensed it at once. She was halfway through her breakfast when the telephone rang, an event so rare in her little house that she regarded it with immediate attention. The voice on the other end belonged to Inspector Graves, stripped of its usual brisk confidence. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you ought to know. There's been another development." "That is seldom good news," she replied calmly. "What sort of development?" "A disappearance. Mrs. Edith Fowler." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a brief moment. "I see." "And when was she last seen?" "Late last night. A neighbour heard her leave the cottage around 11. This morning. Nothing. No note. No luggage." "And her walking shoes?" Miss Marple asked quietly. There was a pause. "Missing." By mid-morning the village was alive with fresh excitement. The familiar rhythm of gossip resumed, faster now, sharpened by fear. "She's done a runner," Mrs. Pritchard declared at the Blue Boar. "Guilty conscience, if you ask me." "Or she's been silenced," said Mr. Harper grimly. Miss Marple said neither. She sat near the window, hands folded, observing how easily suspicion jumped from one person to another, like a restless flame. Inspector Graves conducted a thorough search. The chalk pit was examined once more, the path surrounding it trampled again by boots and policemen. No sign of Mrs. Fowler emerged, no body, no struggle, no discarded belongings. "It complicates matters," Graves admitted to Miss Marple later that afternoon. "She was the last person we can place with Miss Finch before her death." "Last people are often accused of being first," Miss Marple replied, "and disappearances invite conclusions that may not be deserved." Graves sighed. "You're suggesting she may not be dead." "I am suggesting," said Miss Marple, "that people vanish for many reasons. Fear is one of them." That evening Miss Marple paid a discreet visit to Henry Collins. He looked worse than ever, his normally neat appearance unravelling. "They're asking questions again," he said nervously. "About Mrs. Fowler, about Arabella." "They should," Miss Marple replied gently. "It would be a pity if the wrong person suffered." Henry stared at her. You don't think Grant did it? I think Mr. Grant was useful to someone, Miss Marple said. That is not quite the same thing. She left him pale and shaken. Later, as dusk fell, Miss Marple walked once more toward the chalk pit. She did not expect to find anything new there, not in the obvious sense. Instead, she watched, listened, noted who appeared and who did not. A single figure stood at the edge of the path, half hidden by shadow. Mrs. Hawthorne. You shouldn't be here alone, Miss Marple said quietly as she approached. I needed to see it, the housekeeper replied. Where she died. Miss Marple studied her carefully. You are afraid? Yes, Mrs. Hawthorne said simply, because I remember something else now. They sat together on a fallen tree trunk, the evening insects beginning their chorus. The letters, Mrs. Hawthorne continued. They weren't the only ones. Miss Finch received a visit, a woman, several weeks ago. She argued with her, threatened her. Mrs. Fowler? Miss Marple asked. No, someone else. Someone older, someone who knew the family. Miss Marple's heart beat a little faster, though her voice remained calm. Did Arabella tell you her name? Mrs. Hawthorne shook her head, but she said one thing very clearly. If the truth comes out, she told me, it will ruin more than one life. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Truth often does. That night, Inspector Graves made an announcement that unsettled the village further. Oliver Grant would be released pending further investigation. The reaction was immediate and violent. They're letting him go, Mrs. Pritchard exclaimed. After everything? Miss Marple listened, her expression serene. The release was not justice, it was necessity. The case against Grant had thinned dangerously and Graves knew it. What no one else noticed was how one person reacted with visible alarm. Miss Eleanor Briggs, the retired governess, fainted cleanly at the news. Miss Marple visited her the next morning. You were very fond of Arabella, Miss Marple said, once Miss Briggs had recovered. I tried to protect her, Miss Briggs whispered. From her own history. And from others? Miss Briggs turned away. Some pasts are better left buried. Miss Marple rose to leave. Burying things rarely keeps them hidden forever. As she walked home, her thoughts arranged themselves with increasing clarity. Mrs. Fowler's disappearance, the family scandal, the woman who visited Finchwood House, the carefully directed suspicion, the killer, Miss Marple now believed had not acted in panic. They had planned, they had watched, and they had counted on the village's eagerness to blame the obvious man. The moon rose once more over Little Barton, pale and observant. Somewhere within the quiet houses someone was realizing, perhaps for the first time, that Miss Marple's gentle curiosity had begun to circle very close indeed. And when that realization fully dawned, Miss Marple knew the game would change. Chapter 7. A Pattern of Fear. By the 7th day, Little Barton had reached a state of collective agitation that Miss Marple recognised all too well. The village no longer knew whom to condemn, and that uncertainty made everyone defensive. Doors were locked earlier. Friendly greetings became brief nods. People watched one another with narrowed eyes, measuring words as though they might betray something dangerous. Fear, Miss Marple reflected, was contagious, but it was rarely shared equally. She began the day with a visit to Inspector Graves, who looked as though he had slept badly. We can't find Mrs. Fowler, he said bluntly. No money withdrawn, no belongings taken. Either she panicked and ran without thinking, or she didn't leave at all. Which do you believe? Miss Marple asked. I don't know what to believe any more. Miss Marple smiled kindly. That is often the moment when one begins to think properly. She asked permission to review the statements once more, particularly those taken in the first 48 hours. Graves hesitated, then handed them over. Desperation, Miss Marple knew, was an ally. Alone with the papers, she read slowly, not for facts, but for tone. She noticed how often certain phrases repeated themselves. Shocked, never suspected such a quiet girl. People clung to the idea that Arabella Finch had been innocent, untouched by complication. It comforted them. But fear, Miss Marple thought, did not grow in such clean soil. That afternoon she paid another call on Miss Eleanor Briggs. The former governess lay on her sofa, pale and rigid, her hands clenched in the folds of a blanket. You're not well, Miss Marple observed. I cannot rest, Miss Briggs replied. Every sound, every knock at the door. Fear does that, Miss Marple said gently. It grows louder in silence. Miss Briggs closed her eyes. I tried to protect her. From whom? From her mother's mistakes, Miss Briggs whispered. From the man who ruined her. Miss Marple leaned forward. Tell me about him. Miss Briggs hesitated, then spoke in a rush. Arabella's mother loved badly. She trusted a man who promised marriage and delivered disgrace. He vanished before the child was born. Years later, there were rumours he'd returned to the county under another name. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And Arabella believed she'd found him? Yes, she received letters. He claimed rights, money, recognition. And she was afraid, Miss Marple murmured. Yes, afraid that everything would come out. Miss Marple thanked her and left quietly. Outside, the air felt sharper, as though the village itself were holding its breath. The pattern was emerging clearly now. That evening, Miss Marple made an unusual choice. She invited several villagers to tea, Mrs. Pritchard, Mr. Harper, and notably Henry Collins. The gathering appeared innocent enough. Cups, cakes, polite conversation. Miss Marple observed. Henry Collins fidgeted constantly. Mrs. Pritchard talked too much. Mr. Harper watched everyone with a teacher's old habit of attention. And Mrs. Fowler? Miss Marple asked lightly. Such a shock, her disappearance. Mrs. Pritchard leaned forward. I always thought she was jealous of Arabella. Cousins often are. Henry Collins stiffened. That's unfair. Is it? Miss Marple asked mildly. Henry flushed. She was trying to help her. Help can be dangerous, Miss Marple replied, especially when it involves secrets. The conversation shifted, but the effect lingered. Miss Marple had planted something, not an accusation, but a discomfort. Later that night she walked past Finchwood House once more. A light burned briefly in an upstairs window, then went dark. Officially the house was empty. Miss Marple did not believe in coincidences. The following morning brought confirmation of her unease. Inspector Graves arrived at her door, pale and shaken. "We found Mrs. Fowler," he said. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Alive? Yes, hiding, in a disused shepherd's hut beyond the South Fields. Afraid, Miss Marple said. As I thought. Mrs. Fowler's story, when it came, was fragmented and tearful. She had fled because she believed she would be blamed, perhaps arrested. She admitted meeting Arabella near the chalk pit that morning, admitted warning her. About what? Graves demanded. About the letters, Mrs. Fowler sobbed. About the man who claimed to be her father. Miss Marple watched closely. Did you see this man? No. Only his letters. And you left Arabella alive? Miss Marple said. Yes, I swear it. Miss Marple believed her. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, knitting steadily now. The final shape of the truth was nearly complete. Arabella had gone to meet someone who frightened her enough to change her shoes, enough to leave the safety of the churchyard, someone who knew her family history intimately, someone who had been watching her for weeks. Miss Marple's thoughts returned again and again to Miss Eleanor Briggs, her collapse at Oliver Grant's release, her fierce desire to protect Arabella, her knowledge of the past. Protection, Miss Marple reflected, could become possession when driven by fear. As dusk settled, Miss Marple rose and put on her hat. It was time, she knew, for a test, not of evidence, but of character. She would speak quite casually of a man returning under another name, and she would watch who reacted, for in her long experience, guilt did not always shout. Sometimes it flinched, and Miss Marple, gentle as ever, intended to be watching very closely indeed. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Quiet Test. Miss Marple had long believed that truth revealed itself most readily when invited politely. Accusations hardened people, suggestions unsettled them. By the 8th day she knew precisely which method was required. She began, as she so often did, with tea. Miss Eleanor Briggs received her in visible agitation, her movements stiff, her eyes darting at every sound beyond the cottage walls. Miss Marple, calm as ever, settled herself near the window and poured. I had the most interesting conversation with Inspector Graves this morning, she said lightly, about that man Arabella believed was her father. Miss Briggs's teacup rattled faintly against its saucer. Did you know, Miss Marple continued as though absorbed in her knitting, that he may not have been her father at all, merely someone who claimed to be hoping to profit? Miss Briggs swallowed. There are dreadful people in the world. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, especially those who believe themselves entitled. She paused deliberately. Inspector Graves wonders whether this man might have been present on the wedding morning. Miss Briggs rose abruptly. That's impossible. Miss Marple looked up. Why? Because he would never dare. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People driven by desperation often dare more than they intend. Miss Briggs sat again, her composure visibly fraying. Miss Marple watched with the patient interest of someone observing a familiar pattern. Arabella trusted you greatly, Miss Marple said softly. She turned to you when she was afraid. Yes, Miss Briggs whispered. She had no one else. No one else, Miss Marple repeated, except the man who frightened her, and the woman who believed she was protecting her. Miss Briggs's hands clenched. I would never harm her. Miss Marple inclined her head. I did not say you would. Only that protection can sometimes become control. The silence that followed was long and strained. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage. Tea once again, though this time with a broader audience. Inspector Graves, Mrs. Pritchard, Mr. Harper, Henry Collins, and notably Miss Eleanor Briggs were present. Miss Marple chose her moment carefully. It is remarkable, she said conversationally, how often old scandals return when a wedding approaches. I recall a case in Bournemouth, a child born out of wedlock, a supposed father returning years later under an assumed name. The poor girl was terrified. Miss Briggs's face drained of colour. The father, Miss Marple went on, was not the father at all, merely a man who had loved the girl's mother once and could not bear to be forgotten. A sharp intake of breath came from Miss Briggs. He confronted the girl, Miss Marple said gently, not to claim her, but to silence her. Miss Briggs stood. You're talking nonsense. Inspector Graves looked sharply at her. Miss Briggs, Miss Marple laid a hand on his arm. Not yet, Inspector. She turned back to Miss Briggs. Arabella trusted you. She came to you in fear, and you believed, quite sincerely, that revealing the truth would destroy her. Miss Briggs trembled. I was trying to save her. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, by stopping her wedding. The room was very quiet. You followed her, Miss Marple continued. You knew she meant to confront the man who wrote the letters. You feared what would happen if she spoke, to Mr. Grant, to the village. Miss Briggs shook her head wildly. I didn't mean... You met her at the chalk pit, Miss Marple said. You argued. You tried to persuade her to leave everything as it was. Tears streamed down Miss Briggs's face. She wouldn't listen. And when she turned away, Miss Marple said, you pushed her. The words fell softly, but they landed with devastating force. I didn't think, Miss Briggs sobbed. She slipped. It was an accident. Inspector Graves stepped forward. Miss Briggs, you're under arrest. Miss Marple watched quietly as the truth at last emerged. Miss Eleanor Briggs, the devoted governess, had been Arabella's mother's former lover, the man who had ruined her life, returning years later as a woman burdened by guilt and obsession. Unable to bear Arabella's determination to reveal the past, she had followed her, argued, and in a moment of panic killed the girl she believed she was protecting. As Miss Briggs was led away, Miss Marple sat back, folding her hands. It is always so tragic, she murmured, when love curdles into possession. Outside, little Barton's bells began to ring for evening prayers. The village would soon know the truth, and Miss Marple, gentle and observant as ever, knew that only one chapter remained, the quiet reckoning that followed. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The village of Little Barton awoke the next morning to the news that Miss Eleanor Briggs had confessed. The revelation spread with astonishing speed, leaving conversations paused mid-sentence and teacups trembling in their saucers. For once, certainty was justified, but the shock remained. Miss Marple, as always, observed with quiet composure. She had long anticipated the confession, the subtle signs, the flinches, the unguarded moments, the faint inconsistencies in stories had been impossible to overlook. Still, she allowed the formal announcement to take its place in the world before speaking. Inspector Graves, at the head of the small gathering in the vicarage, recounted the facts succinctly. Miss Briggs admitted to following Arabella Finch on her wedding morning. She argued with her at the chalk pit. In the struggle, Miss Finch fell. The act was not premeditated murder, but an unintended consequence of Miss Briggs's fear and obsession. Mrs. Pritchard gasped audibly. All this time we blamed him, she exclaimed, nodding toward Oliver Grant, who stood quietly, pale but relieved. I knew it couldn't be him. He's far too straightforward. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sometimes the most obvious person is the easiest to accuse. She rose and addressed the room. It is a sad thing to realize that love, when twisted by fear, can lead to destruction. Miss Briggs loved Arabella in a manner she believed protective, but protection and control are easily confused. Inspector Graves nodded. And the letters? He asked. Miss Marple explained. They were written to maintain influence. The writer never intended for Arabella to meet her fate directly, but she underestimated the consequences of her actions. As often happens, a minor attempt at control escalates beyond intention. Henry Collins, sitting stiffly, murmured, I suppose I never really understood her, or the situation. Few do, at first, Miss Marple said gently. It is only through observing the small, seemingly unimportant details that the full picture becomes visible. Miss Marple walked over to Oliver Grant, who now seemed almost at peace. You were fortunate to remain yourself amidst the storm, she said softly. The village can be hasty in judgment, but you kept honesty as your companion. He inclined his head. I owe you thanks, Miss Marple. Without your insight, I would have been lost in the accusations. She shook her head. I merely followed what the heart and behaviour of others revealed. Truth, when examined carefully, shows itself clearly. The villagers listened as she recounted the sequence of events in careful, understated detail. Arabella's fear, the secret letters, the visit of the woman who had once been intimately connected with her mother, the confrontation at the chalk pit, and the tragic accident. Every observation, every small clue, fell into place without a sense of theatricality, yet the logic was undeniable. It is rare, Miss Marple said in conclusion, for tragedy to come not from malice but from misjudged intentions. And it is a reminder that those closest to us, when driven by fear or obsession, may act in ways we cannot foresee. Silence settled over the room. The villagers, absorbing the truth, realized that their certainty had been misplaced. Rumours, assumptions, and casual judgments had pointed fingers in the wrong direction, almost obscuring the human tragedy beneath. Inspector Graves sighed. It seems justice will now proceed as it must, though the sorrow remains. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, and the village must remember that sorrow is often the companion of understanding. As the gathering dispersed, Oliver Grant left quietly. The burden of suspicion lifted. The vicar gently reminded the remaining villagers of their responsibilities to one another, and life in Little Barton began, cautiously, to resume its familiar rhythm. Miss Marple, returning home, reflected on human nature, its fear, its affection, its obsession, and its fragile limits. She sipped her tea, folded her knitting neatly on her lap, and looked out over her small garden where roses swayed in the afternoon breeze. People rarely act from simple motives, she murmured, and intentions, however well-meaning, can sometimes have consequences far beyond expectation. Outside, the village seemed calm once more, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, the currents of ambition, love, fear, and secret histories never truly ceased. They simply waited, until curiosity, misjudgment, or circumstance brought them again to light. And Miss Marple, gentle, perceptive, and ever watchful, would be there, quietly observing, understanding, and when necessary guiding the truth to its rightful place. Chapter 10. Reflections and Ripples. The village of Little Barton, normally so gentle and predictable in its rhythms, seemed oddly subdued in the days following Miss Briggs's confession. While the immediate threat of a hidden murderer had been removed, a subtler, more pervasive tension lingered in the air. Shops opened later, voices were quieter in the streets, and people carried themselves with a caution that had not existed before. Even the church, so often a place of comfort and ceremony, now seemed to hum with the faint echo of tragedy. Miss Marple, however, observed all this with calm detachment. Her little house at the edge of the village, with its tidy garden and neat rows of roses, was unchanged. The kettle whistled precisely at 5:30 each evening, and her knitting needles clicked at their usual steady pace. Yet her mind, ever alert, catalogued everything. The way Mrs. Pritchard's voice faltered when mentioning Arabella, the slight twitch in Henry Collins' left eye when he thought no one was looking, even the way the light fell across Finchwood House, now quiet and sombre, as if mourning its own past. On the morning after the confession, Miss Marple set out for her customary walk, intending to visit the edge of the chalk pit once more. She moved slowly, deliberately, pausing now and then to examine a flower, a footprint, or the curve of a path. Her observations, she reminded herself, were never for herself alone. They were for understanding the behaviour of others and for noting the ripple effects of actions long since completed. The first person she encountered was Henry Collins, pacing near the village green. His usual composure had evaporated entirely. Miss Marple noticed the way his hands were clenched at his sides and the tense stiffness of his posture. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," she said pleasantly. "I hope you slept a little better after yesterday's revelations." Henry paused, swallowing hard. "Better, perhaps, though nothing feels quite right." "That is natural," Miss Marple replied. "The mind adjusts slowly when it has been misled. Sometimes even the most obvious truths need to settle before they can be accepted." Henry looked at her, a mixture of anxiety and relief in his expression. "I suppose I never truly understood, until now." Miss Marple nodded. "Understanding comes, inevitably, to those who observe and listen. You were involved, Mr. Collins, but your intentions were honourable, and yet the ripples of this tragedy have reached farther than any of us might have imagined." He glanced toward the chalk pit, the edge of which gleamed faintly in the early sunlight. "It's strange," he said, voice almost a whisper. "The pit, it feels different now. Empty, but heavy somehow, as though it remembers." Miss Marple's gaze followed his. "Memories are rarely left to the inanimate, Mr. Collins. They exist in the minds and hearts of those who witness events. Still, the pit has been a witness to more than one sorrowful story in its time." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hooves. Miss Marple turned to see Inspector Graves, riding in on a modest pony, a rare smile breaking the usual seriousness of his expression. "Miss Marple, Mr. Collins," he called, "a little fresh air before the day begins. It seems the village is slowly returning to its routines, though with caution." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, Inspector. But even routines are altered after a tragedy. Little Barton will move forward, of course. But the awareness of its fragility lingers," Graves nodded. "Indeed. And some will never forget, even when the case is closed." Miss Marple allowed a small smile. "Memory is the great keeper of justice, Inspector. It ensures that lessons, however painful, are never entirely lost." By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way to Finchwood House. The grand estate now felt subdued, its usual vibrancy muted by grief and by the shadow of its recent events. Mrs. Hawthorne, still visibly shaken, greeted her at the door. "Miss Marple," she said, wringing her hands, "it is quiet. Too quiet." Even the servants moved like ghosts. "Loss has a way of quieting life for a time," Miss Marple observed, "but the house itself is unchanged. It is people who carry the echoes of sorrow." They walked through the halls together, pausing in rooms that had once been filled with laughter, music, and excitement for the impending wedding. Gifts remained untouched, the golden ribbons still catching the light, now appearing oddly tragic in their unbroken perfection. "I never imagined it could happen," Mrs. Hawthorne said softly. "Arabella looked so young, so full of life." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and yet she was aware of the dangers in her life. She faced them with courage, which is why the incident, though accidental, remains tragic. Courage often draws consequences far larger than intention." Mrs. Hawthorne led her to Arabella's bedroom. The space had been left untouched, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn to catch the morning sun. Miss Marple's eyes fell upon a small collection of letters on the writing desk, carefully tied with a ribbon. "Were these the letters?" she asked. "Yes," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "The ones from the person who had once been part of the family's past. I never could bear to read them fully." Miss Marple picked up one letter, reading it briefly with a measured attention. The handwriting was precise, controlled, yet each line seemed to carry a weight of fear and expectation. "Ah," she murmured. The words are almost polite, and yet the fear beneath them is unmistakable. People often hide what they most wish to convey beneath a veneer of civility. Mrs. Hawthorne sighed. She tried to understand, she really did. "But the past, it is so difficult to escape." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "and sometimes even those who love us can misinterpret how best to protect us. In trying to shield Arabella, Miss Briggs acted in a way she thought would save her. It is only when we examine intention alongside outcome that we grasp the full story. The two women walked slowly into the garden. The roses, recently pruned, appeared brighter in the afternoon sunlight. Miss Marple knelt to examine a single bud, noting its delicate resilience. "Life, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said gently, "is often like this rose, fragile yet persistent. Even when tragedy strikes, there is growth. Even when the story seems complete, ripples continue to move outward." By evening, Miss Marple returned to her own home, the air growing cooler as shadows lengthened across the village lanes. She found herself reflecting not only on Arabella Finch's death, but on the ways in which fear, secrecy, and loyalty intertwined in human relationships. She thought of Miss Briggs, whose love had become possessive, of Henry Collins, whose loyalty had been tested, of Mr. Grant, who had suffered suspicion for no fault of his own. Miss Marple poured herself tea and seated herself near the window. Across the garden, the last rays of sunlight struck the petals of her roses, illuminating them in a way that made even the smallest details of their structure visible. She observed the interplay of shadow and light, noting the way the tiniest movement in a branch could change the pattern of reflection on the window pane. "Everything has consequences," she murmured. "Even the smallest action can ripple outward, affecting people far beyond immediate perception. And yet, kindness and understanding can ripple too, sometimes more enduringly than sorrow." As she sat there, the village of Little Barton seemed to slow. The events of the past week, the disappearance, the arguments, the tragic accident, had left an indelible mark, but life was beginning to resume its quieter rhythm. Children played on the green, shopkeepers reopened their stores, and the church bells rang once more, this time accompanied by a sense of cautious hope rather than dread. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the broader implications of the tragedy. Arabella Finch's death, while accidental, had exposed hidden truths about human behaviour. The power of fear, the potency of misplaced loyalty, the subtle ways in which intention can clash with consequence. She reflected on how villagers had leapt to judgment, how assumptions had clouded reasoning, and how the quiet, observant mind could untangle these threads without the need for dramatics or spectacle. By nightfall, Miss Marple had resolved to write brief notes to those affected, offering subtle guidance and reassurance. A letter to Henry Collins, gently reminding him that loyalty was not a fault. One to Mr. Grant, acknowledging the unjust suspicion he had endured, and a short note to Mrs. Hawthorne, encouraging her to maintain the home in Arabella's memory as a place of warmth and continuity rather than sorrow. As the moon rose over Little Barton, silvering the rooftops and hedgerows, Miss Marple settled into her chair, knitting once more. Outside, the village was quiet, yet she sensed that the ripples of the past week would continue for some time. Still, she felt confident that, in time, the village would understand, just as she always did, that human nature, with all its complexities, was neither wholly good nor wholly evil, but endlessly instructive, and in observing it, gently and patiently, one could find the truth, not always comforting, but invariably illuminating. Miss Marple leaned back, her hands folded over her knitting. She watched the stars twinkle in the night sky, serene and eternal, and reflected that, though humans often faltered, life itself endured. And that, in the end, was a truth worth remembering.